Now, before the break, we heard from former Congressman Steve Israel and got the perspective from the House side of Washington. In this segment, we'll hear from the Senate perspective. And for that, I'm joined by decorated war veteran and former Democratic Senator from Nebraska, Bob Kerrey, the Senator, former Navy SEAL, awarded the Medal of Honor. And on the heels of Veterans Day, thank you for your service, Senator. I want to talk a little bit later in the interview. You were the Grand Marshal of the parade on that front. Before we talk about the optics and the process, let's talk about the stakes. With a fire hose of news, what I think largely went, if not ignored, but we moved on, was the president's legal team made the argument that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue where there was no remedy or no punishment for the president. The argument, in essence, is the president, is above the law, the checks and balances, there is no place for it. And if you're a sitting president, you can do anything you want and not be held to account. To me, I think that's how impeachment should be looked at in this prism. Do you agree that these are the states we're literally talking about when it comes to a democracy?
Well, yes, except there's explicit language in the Constitution giving Congress the authority to either impeach a president or a federal judge. And it's, in Federalist 65, Hamilton explains why it's there. It is a check on the executive branch. That's why it's there. Article 1 describes the Congress. Article 2 describes the President. And in Article 1, there's explicit authority for the Congress to impeach for high crimes and misdemeanors. It's true, the definition of those three words are vague, but Congress gets to make that decision. There's no way that Republicans or the president could defend the president saying this is unconstitutional. It is completely, not only is it constitutional, it's in the Constitution.
What we don't see at home are the conversations that happen with lawmakers when the cameras aren't rolling. You were there for the Clinton impeachment. What are the kinds of conversations across aisles, if you will, that are happening among the senators with the likelihood that eventually it's going to come to that chamber here, and whether it's along party line votes or whatever will come through the House, at the end there'll be a trial in the Senate. How did you take us back during the Clinton impeachment? Were minds already made up? Did people wait to hear the testimony before coming to a conclusion? And how much did they look at both precedent and also prologue as to what would come out of the decisions, whether or not to take that ultimate action?
Look, first of all, let me stipulate it's always going to be more difficult for a Republican to convict a Republican president, because there will be Republican Americans who don't want the president convicted under any circumstances. And it was difficult for a Democrat to do the same for a Democratic president to convict. But most of us, I believe, were trying to figure out what does history say about this? What did the founders say about this? What in particular did Madison and Hamilton and Jay say in the Federalist Papers? And how was it used in the early stages of the Republic? The Congress did impeach a federal judge, Pickering. The Congress did impeach and attempted to convict a president in 1868. And I think most of us were studying those cases and trying to understand what the Constitution meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. How do you organize it? Because other than we had established precedent to say that the Chief Justice should preside, there was considerable disagreement about what authority the Chief Justice should have when they're sitting in the presiding officer's chair. So there was a lot of uncertainty, but no uncertainty about the authority of Congress to impeach and the process of moving to the Senate to have a trial.
It was interesting to that point. Former Arizona Senator Flake said, if you did this vote in private, you'd have 35 Republican senators that would vote to impeach. And I got to tell you, I got a little bit of a lesson. I said, well, obviously you can't do it in private. You actually can. If as little as 3 Republican senators voted with all the Democrats to allow there to be a secret ballot, if you will, the president would have to go along with it, but nonetheless, there is that as a possibility. I'm not so sure how healthy that would be, in terms of the public discourse after the fact, trying to guess who voted which way, but nonetheless, you were there, like I said, and it was a totally different case, and it was a totally different question that the American public was faced with than you with Clinton, but were the private conversations different than the public votes in that you mentioned the political considerations, but at the end of the day, when you voted yay or nay, you and your colleagues, you don't have to put names on them, did some vote differently than the way they wanted because they were a D or an R?
Well, I think the answer to that is impossible to tell. I can only say to you that I didn't. I tried to make a decision based upon whether or not I felt it was a high crime and misdemeanor and an impeachable offense. And you're quite right, by the way. The Senate can write its rules. The established precedent is that the presiding officer will be the Chief Justice, but during the Johnson trial, Chief Justice Chase actually made significant rulings as to what was admissible and what could be debated. So it's not likely that they'll go back to those days, but the Senate could. I think it's highly unlikely that they would write a rule saying the vote's going to be secret. The debate probably will at some point get closed off, but I think the record will show and the public will know how everybody votes.
You know, sometimes we forget what we're even talking about here, but you've got as much foreign policy chops as anybody. We're talking about literally a shakedown of an ally with a fear of an enemy across the border, that if you want the money, I want something in return. And the founding fathers, you said, were pretty clear. They didn't mention, obviously, or think Ukraine, but they were worried about France or England at the time and foreign involvement in our elections. This was actually conceivable, and it doesn't seem like the facts are too much in question right now. Again, put yourself back in the Senate. This one seems definitely in that area code of a high crime and a misdemeanor. It's not a partisan witch hunt.
Well, it's definitely not a partisan witch hunt. I mean, there's sufficient amount of evidence that the president tried to persuade a leader of a foreign country to intervene in the presidential election in 2020 by investigating, the time anyway, his likely opponent in the 2020 election. So that's never been done before. I hear friends of mine who are Republicans say, well, we're always trying to interfere with elections, and we're always trying to get leaders to do this, that, and the other thing for a variety of different reasons. But it's never occurred that a president's called a foreign leader, especially, I mean, gosh, this happened 2 days after the Mueller report. So it's not like you're dealing with a situation here where the publics are saying that this is something that a president ought to be able to do. I just don't believe that. And I urge Republicans, particularly in the private sector, to ask themselves this question. If you have a Democratic president in 2021, and he or she makes a phone call to Xi Jinping in China and asks them to investigate their political opponent, could be a member of Congress, how would you feel about that? I think you'd be outraged, and you'd say, no, that's not a legitimate thing. It's wrong, and I think it's likely you'd walk right to the edge and said we at least have to consider impeachment.
A final question. There was a poll that came out from Axios, and it showed more than 60% of the American public say they don't recognize their country anymore, given all the acrimony and the division that we have. And I asked this in context of the Veterans Day parade yesterday, of which you were the Grand Marshal. And the president, unlike his predecessors, chose to appear. And while his comments, I think, were rather innocuous, you still had the cheering and the booing that was going on. How upsetting is it, or was it, that we've gotten to this point right now where everything is seen in shirts and skids in red and blue?
Well, look, I personally think it was appropriate for the president to come and speak at the Veterans Day parade. He's not a veteran. Controversy of how he managed to stay out of the Vietnam War. But to the question, do you not recognize the country? I'm telling you, it was like from 23rd Street up to 46th or 7th Street, and I was one of 5 Grand Marshals, including 2 men who had fought in the Korea, and one in the Second World War at Iwo Jima, and the other in Korea. It was moving, because there's, I mean, if you don't live in New York City and you say, well, gee, New Yorkers can't be patriotic, they were patriotic. They were waving flags. They weren't talking about politics. There was a couple of Trump signs and a little bit going on, but it was a mammoth and moving expression of patriotism and appreciation for men and women who've served in the military. I mean, that part of my country, I definitely recognize. And we share values. I mean, the shared value of appreciating self-discipline, and appreciating self-sacrifice, appreciating dedication to a cause. Everybody that was on the line in the streets yesterday share that value, whether they're Trump supporters or not. The shared values that underlie what this country is all about are still strong and still there.
And that's a good point to wrap it on. Senator, I appreciate so much the time. And again, thank you for your service. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, everyone. When we come back, we're going to pivot from impeachment, and instead we'll head to the highest court of the land. We're going to go to the Supreme Court because it's talking about Dreamers and whether or not President Trump can end that very program to protect hundreds of thousands of young immigrants who only know the United States from being deported.